So hey everyone, I am Andrea and I am customer experience at ProdPad, and with us today is the wonderful friend, oh he says oh dear, the wonderful C.Todd Lombardo.
Hi
And
there.
we are going to be, hey, thanks for joining me.
Hey, thanks for the invite.
Anytime. We're going to be talking about product ethics, which is
Yes,
I think one of my favorite topics ever,
yes.
ever, considering how questionable people can get.
Right, right. And I
Right?
think that's part of this. And I really wanted this to be a conversation, for you and I, not necessarily a webinar, because I don't feel like I'm any kind of authority on the ethics
And
of product or what
that's the
product should.
beauty of ethics, right?
Right,
Who
right.
has
I'm
the
of anyway,
authority?
really. So I think it really does needs to be a kind of a conversation. Um, and I'm what I don't know about is if there's comments or things that people want to react to. Maybe we should
Yeah, absolutely. So there is
find a way to do
a,
that too.
I'm going to try to set up my second monitor here as well, but there is a Q&A and a chat tab if you
Yeah.
guys want to drop us questions about anything that we are going to discuss today. So please do that.
Mm.
So Sita, how do you want to kick this off?
Well, I think one of the things that I think I'd like to maybe kick it off by talking a little bit or having a discussion around. So my partner is a surgeon, and so she had to take the Hippocratic Oath, and there's part of this as to, oh, okay, you need to take an oath that says, I will do no harm to my patients. And I've always wondered, should we as product people and product professionals do a similar kind of thing? Like, I will not harm, I don't want to do any harm to the people who I'm designing products for. And I know in the architecture world, that's taken a lot more seriously than, say, the digital product world.
Mhm.
Because if you design a building and it's not designed right, people could die. You could have a whole bunch of people die because the building collapses on itself.
Of course.
And so I'm curious to, what are your thoughts? What are other people's thoughts around having, is that even a step? Is it going to be a meaningless oath? I know it is somewhat of a, most medical students, at least in the United States, take this Hippocratic Oath or some version of it. I know there's a few versions out there. But, what are your thoughts on it, Andrea?
My thoughts. I have a lot of thoughts. I think as product managers, we definitely need to be aware of what we're doing and why we're doing it. Actually, so I grabbed this book that I highly recommend to everyone. And I do apologize for the French here, but it's a book called History of Humans, How We Fuck Things Up. And it kind of goes through it's really good, but it kind of goes through the process of explaining how Homo sapiens basically destroyed Neanderthals and the Denisovians by constantly wanting to fix things. So as we like to solutioneer, but there's that difference of solutioneering and then actually solving the problem, which as product managers, we have the ability to take that step back, or should have the ability, and kind of go, okay, but what are we actually trying to solve? And as I was reading through this book, one of the stories that kind of got my attention quite a bit is Thomas Midgley Jr. I don't know if you know who that is, but it is definitely
No.
someone that everyone should know who it is. So this guy was, he was a solutioneer, and he was contracted to fix the problem with knocking in cars. So think back when cars were first invented and you had to like crack them up. It used to have this like knocking sound that it did, like, and so people are like, okay, how can we fix that? So he was hired, and the first solution that he came up with was adding iodine to the fuel mix, but that was too expensive. So then they went for alcohol, but alcohol was too readily available, so they couldn't use that. So
Yeah.
after many tests, he came up with lead, right? And that's how we ended up with fossil fuels. And who hired this guy?
And leaded gasoline.
Yeah,
Yeah.
General Motors. And General Motors kept telling him, find me a solution that we can actually market. One is too expensive, the other one's too cheap, so people can just get it anywhere. So find me something that I can sell. Now, the fun thing about this whole process is he got really sick and was taken off the project, and several other people got sick and even died during the production process. And
Wow.
the FDA actually called them out and said, you have to prove that this isn't harmful. So in the very, curious FDA way, they couldn't prove that it was the cause, but they also couldn't prove that it wasn't the cause, so they marked it as safe. So at that point, it kind of, begets the question, who was responsible? Was it Thomas Mitchley Jr. or was it General Motors?
Right.
So is the corporation or is the product manager that knowingly got sick?
Who's responsible? And then is the person responsible? I guess in the medical world, you could say that a lot rests on the doctor, and so hence the Hippocratic Oath does, a little bit of buck stops here with the physician. But when it comes to the product world, does the buck stop with product, or is it a designer, or is it the engineer?
Exactly. So like Facebook, who's
the person who has that accountability and responsibility to do that? I think there's definitely I think there's a lot of gray area. There's no single source there, right? It's usually a team that does this. And I think Mike Monteiro wrote a book recently called Ruined by Design, where it's focused more on the designer. But let's say you're a designer designing some particular aspect of a product, and you're not independently wealthy. You need to work to pay your rent or your mortgage. And you're told that you got to go design this thing, and you might look at it and think, there's some real interesting privacy implications here, but you might raise a flag or two, but you might get scolded and saying, no, well, just, ignore that, do your job as a designer and finish the design for this particular product idea. So they go do it because, they're in this job, they need the job to live. And then, what happens even though they may have raised their hand, does that absolve them of responsibility, or does that responsibility get transferred? I think it's a really interesting, it does make the case of who is responsible.
Yes. So somebody just brought up in the Q&A section that there's something called the System Administrator's Code of Ethics by the System Ad, which is a code from the Unix sysadmin background. So even system administrators have a code of ethics. Why shouldn't we?
Yeah,
I mean, we are the ones. Why shouldn't we? We are the ones that are basically designing the vision and the outcomes for this thing. So it's like Facebook, right? Who is responsible for the explosion of stuff that has happened around data privacy? Is it is it Mark? Is it the corporation? Is it the product management team?
Yeah, and let's say you're on the product management team or you're a product manager, and you raised your hand and said, hey, I'm not sure this is really the right thing to do. Should we do this? I think there's an example I remember years ago about a woman who I think she was homosexual by choice and was in the closet. Her family didn't know. And she had joined, when she went off to college, she had joined a gay choir. And I may not have the details quite right. So I apologize. She joined a gay choir, and because of that, joining their Facebook page, they automatically posted something like that to her feed, which all her family saw. And they didn't know that was the case.
Right.
They confronted her about it. It completely caused an issue, and she ended up committing suicide because she was
Facebook did
distraught.
this. Yeah.
Right, and this goes to another area of conversation. So okay, who's the responsible? Is taking some kind of oath a first step in the right direction, even though you might not be held accountable to that, but at least it's a step by saying, hey, I swear that I am not going to do any harm, or I will do what I can to not deliver products to the market that are going to cause people long-term harm. It's kind of also like, and I say long-term harm because we think about the soda industry, right? Having a soda occasionally is fine, or even just like you mentioned, the FDA with the lead thing. It was hard to prove without a reasonable doubt that this is.
But they knew.
What?
But they knew.
They knew something, right?
They took him off the project because he got sick.
Yeah. But with soda, you have a soda every so often with, maybe it has high fructose corn syrup, or maybe not. That's still debatable these days. But if you have 3 sodas a day for 10 years, that actually can cause some pretty serious harm. But there's no short-term notice of I just had a soda, no big deal. You don't feel any worse immediately. There's no immediate consequence. The consequence is much longer term. And I think that's one, it's expensive to understand the implications there. So I think it's, you know, it goes back to, well, would this even think through that? And can we have what I call the second and third order consequences? So there's an immediate consequence, but what happens after that? And if the immediate consequence may be really no big deal, but what's the second and third order? And the example I like to use on this is, actually, here's a question, Andrea. How does a wolf change a river?
I have no idea.
Right? And I think that's the thing is how would a wolf change a river? That's got to be an interesting, oh wait, was there a couple of chats here?
Yeah, so actually, when you were talking about second order consequences, Sean brought up something really fun, which was, so Thomas Mitchell Jr. wasn't just responsible for the wonders that is, leaded gasoline, but he also invented this thing in 2 days. It took him 2 days to come up with a solution, which was back then fridges were exploding because they didn't have the right chemical balance. So he actually invented something called Freon, which is the chemical that actually keeps refrigerators in check, and it's what they use now. The second order outcome to that is that was also applied to aerosol sprays. Yep. And that was directly responsible for the big hole over Australia, right? So, right? And that wasn't what it was supposed to do. It was just supposed to be applied to refrigerators because refrigerators were exploding. You know, speaking of sodas, people can go get sodas because these refrigerators or the fridge containers were exploding. So, you know, they hired him to find a solution. He came up with a solution in 2 days. Great, it worked. But then years later, it ends up affecting, you know, the ozone layer because they ended up applying that same technology to aerosol sprays. But
so let me go back to the question of how does a wolf change a river?
I don't know. I know you're gonna have a fun answer to that.
No, this isn't like a punchline of a joke. Although it might sound like the start of some kind of stand-up comedy routine that I'm secretly creating, which I'm not, by the way. But in the early 1900s, maybe like 1920, 1930, most wolves in the United States, the Yellowstone National Park, pretty much lost most of its population of wolves in the early 1930s or so, I guess. Again, the dates, I might have the dates completely clear. But, and then there was some effort in, I think between the 70s, or maybe it was the 90s, I think it was the 90s, where they tried to reintroduce wolves into this park. Now, I say wolves change rivers, you're like, wait, how does a wolf, they're not an aquatic organism. They don't do this. So you're thinking, right? What do they affect that affects something else that affects something else? Well, wolves are predators. Mm-hmm. And what had happened was there were a lot of elk and deer in the Yellowstone National Forest. They become wildly successful as a species because there was an absence of predators. And with the introduction of a small amount of wolves and a couple of wolf packs, this changed not only the population, but it wasn't like the elk got wiped out because of a few wolves. What happened was the elk, not only their population shrunk a bit, but they changed their behavior and where they went. So less elks eating lots of grass and lots of shrubs. And so what does that mean? Well, when the grass and other shrubs are not eaten as much, they grow more. And over the course of like 3 or 4 years, the vegetation, I was something like quadrupled in height. So now you have more trees. What do trees have? Trees have roots. Those roots dig into the ground and new vegetation comes along. There's a better balance in wolf population. Different predators also are kept at bay. So coyotes were kept at bay because of the wolves as well. So then populations like foxes started to come in, and we're like, wait, how do we start talking about product and we're talking about foxes and wolf rivers?
No, but it makes complete sense. And I actually posted the link to the book that I was reading, or I just finished reading, and I always recommend it to everyone because it basically goes through all the moments in time, like the wolves in Yellowstone, that we try to fix something and we don't think about the consequences.
Right. And very it's similar. Not just the first or second order. Sometimes, like in the case of the wolves, it's like the third and fourth order consequence. Just to finish that story, because of those changes in populations, what ultimately happened is the rivers, because the ground was more solid and the behavior patterns of the organisms had changed significantly just because of a few wolves, the rivers weren't meandering so much, and they changed the how the rivers flowed through Yellowstone Forest. And you can imagine that if this changes just the section of the river in the forest, how does that change the river that's outside the forest?
Right.
So it was a really interesting thing thinking about this, everything is a system. And if you make a change in something, there's going to be a change somewhere else in that system. You just may not know it yet. Just like the example of the Freon. We made a change in the system that it caused another change that we didn't even know about the change in the ozone layer until we started to see a symptom of it. And so part of it is having that level of systems thinking. With a lot of product people are systems thinkers. We're putting together lots of different pieces, parts to put our product to market. So how do we use our brains, our collective brain, to think more thoroughly about that kind of systems thinking? And I don't know how prevalent this is, but that's something I think we could also try to nudge a little bit more in thinking through.
Yeah, definitely. What I like about, using ProdPad and even just knowing Jana is even when we have, discussions, is she'll always go, okay, but what problem are we trying to solve? And kind of take it back to the problem instead of just solutioneering. And I think that's the problem in general, is we start solutioneering and coming up with all these things, much like Thomas Mitchell Jr. They told him, go solve this. What he could have done is focus on fixing the engine, for example. But that's not what they told him to do. They told him come up with a solution, and he came up with a solution. Lack of product management right there.
Right. And this goes back to like I use this simple example and I've used it in a couple of my talks. So I apologize for those who've seen this before. I actually stole this from Wolf Bruning, of product manager of Otto in Germany, but it was a great example of what's the problem and what's the solution. So if there's water on the floor, great. The problem is the floor is wet. What's the solution? You mop it up. But is that really the problem? You ask the question, why? Why is there water on the floor? Is it because somebody spilled a glass of water, or is it because there's a leaky pipe? Oh, if you find out there's a leaky pipe, okay, what's the solution then? Well, you replace the pipe and fix it. Okay, why was the pipe leaking? Oh yeah, well, actually the pressure was too high, it turns out. Oh, okay, why was the pressure too high? Right, so we turn down the pressure. Well, actually, maybe that's not the case. The pressure regulator is actually broken. Okay, why is there? And so part of it is thinking through that by asking why and kind of digging further into it. I think in the case that Wolf mentioned, it was like the inspection schedule didn't match up with the life cycle of the pressure regulator based on the manufacturer. So I was like, wait, how do we go from water on the floor to pressure regulators? Just the same thing with like, how do we go from wolves to rivers? Like they don't necessarily seem to make sense initially, but there's some connect the dots there. And I think as product people, we need to think that way of thinking has to, I think, be more prevalent. But then there's also incentives, right? So if you are that designer or product manager who raises their hand, are the incentives there for you? Are your incentives there to support doing the right thing?
Yeah, definitely.
And I'm not sure that's always the case. Right? The example I gave earlier was like, oh, well, person needs their job, so they're going to quietly shut up and do their job and move on because companies need to make money to exist. And if we don't have that, so what do you do when you are thinking, oh, this might make us some money, but is it really going to make us money in an ethical way?
Yeah, I think you do definitely have to take the time to think about those things. And one thing that popped into my mind as you were talking is Teresa Torres's opportunity tree. Because it's not just about finding a solution, it's about mapping out all of your solutions and understanding what actually links back to the objective that you have, which I think is really interesting. And based on what you said as well, it's not about who has the loudest voice, right? It's about what's actually the best solution.
Right.
And then if you take that one step further, what's actually the ethical solution? At this point, I just want to make sure you can get involved. So please do.
Feel free. Like this wants to be
a
conversation. This wasn't about Andrea and or I sort of presenting as some product ethics authority here. More about how do we provoke and have conversations and think this through of what could we solutionize to solve this problem.
I do agree that maybe we are getting to a point where we might actually need a code of ethics. I think it's the right thing. I mean, all these issues come up particularly with data issues, right? I mean, I think GDPR was like a slap in the face of saying, if you're not going to write a code of ethics, we'll write it for you.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that was one side swipe for us as product people. Just somebody going, okay, somebody needs to stop this.
Yeah, I
So
think you're right. And there's also
are we
sorry.
going to take it to the point where somebody needs to stop us, or are we going to think about that ourselves?
Right. And that goes back to consequences. When do you stop, and how do you stop, and why do you stop? But what's the consequence? We go, oh my God, I didn't realize that was happening. I didn't even think that could happen. Uh, what do we do now? Right. My guess is when they were solving the problem of Freon and putting aerosol in the air, they probably didn't realize that there was a much larger consequence of this is going to actually hurt our atmosphere and potentially cause a significant amount of
Do you want to know?
other
Do you want to
changes.
know something fun? I didn't know this, but the ozone layer wasn't discovered till like 1980.
Yeah, right.
So
And
how
it's
would
part
they
of that.
know?
The thing is, you don't even know about these things. So how can you discover them, right? And that goes to the part of like, if you don't know what you don't know what you don't know, right? There's an element of it sounds very Rumsfeldian. For those who are not familiar with the U.S., there was a former Secretary of State, Donald Rumsfeld, who talked about we know what we know, we know what we don't know. And it was kind of somewhat laughed at in the press because it was overly obvious, but you also wanted to, the way he framed it just didn't come off all that great. But there are things that we know we don't know we don't know, and that's a great example of like we didn't discover the ozone layer until the 80s, but we were doing Freon how long ago? Uh,
1940s, so that was
yeah.
40 years. That's why there's a hole in the ozone layer.
Right. And so let's think about that in terms of our product. There's a lot, and this is why I talked about long-term consequences later. We may not even know about certain things because there's no initial long-term consequence. Drink a soda, you're fine. But drink a soda 3 times a
Every
day for 30 years, probably not necessarily good for you, your teeth or your body, etc. And so what is it that we can do to start to not only have that initial code of ethics, but then be measuring ourselves along the way to seeing, are we learning are there any new consequences that have come up based on usage of our product? What happens as these things are going, and can we start to make changes as we look at those outcomes?
What's interesting that also just popped into my head is I watched this documentary a while ago about how, particularly in the US, I'm sure it's everywhere, but there's in the label for, let's say, laundry detergents, there's an item that says fragrance, and that's all it says, fragrance. What they don't tell you is what chemicals goes into that fragrance and what the effect of that is. And one of the things this guy brought up is, well, I mean, the company might have made the product, somebody might have invented the product, but it's up to marketing to tell people about the side effects. And I'm like, that is a horrible way of thinking about it. So I can create the most horrible thing ever that's going to affect everyone, but it's not up to me. I just created it. If they want to use it, it's your problem. So it's putting the responsibility on the user rather than on the person that created it, or the responsibility on marketing saying, well, you should have said something, or we said
Yeah,
what we
right,
could.
right. No,
We
it's
said
your
what we
fault.
could.
Oh, you want to smoke a cigarette? Great, that's fine. That's your choice. And there's this interesting balance of empowering people to make their own individual choices. And in the US, we really value this individualistic freedom to kind of do what you want, even if it might be bad for you. There's a lot of drive towards that. But as you start to look at it from a systemic perspective, what's good, what an individual might choose to do that may not be good for them long term may not be good for society long term, which is why we have these things called laws. um, so it's this interesting kind of case. And you also have this thing around regulation too, having regulations imposed on companies. This debate rages a lot in the United States right now. One party tends to favor more than the other in terms of politics. And I can see both sides of that coin. It's like, all right, if you deregulate things, you can you'll innovate faster. You'll have less restrictions on what you can and cannot do. However, there are consequences if those things that you do
Absolutely.
harm people in some way. And so it's you got to find the right balance there. There's no one right answer, because if you start to limit everything, then you're going to just get a lot of stagnation, and there's going to be no innovation at all.
And it kind
So
of
it goes
loops
back to
back.
authentic.
It loops back to my first question, which is who is responsible? Is it the engineer? Is it the product manager? Is it the company? Somebody has
Mhm.
to be held responsible in terms of product ethics. So I would love to know what our audience thinks as well. I mean,
Yeah,
guys,
absolutely.
please chat with us
You know, is it
about.
is it leadership? Is it the product itself? Is it the designers and engineers behind the product? And sometimes like ethics is convenient, right? It's convenient for you depending on where what play you are. I think we're all probably guilty of this too. We all might say, yes, save the environment. But then we all might drive a gas-powered automobile or still have some aerosol products in our house or other things, right? And it's like, it's those things are convenient at some time, and we have to really look at ourselves and say, well, what do we really value? And those values often drive our individual behavior, but that goes like difference between macroeconomics and microeconomics. Like we might live in the microeconomic environment, but the macroeconomics is what affects our economies as a whole. So yeah, I'd be curious to what other product folks think of, who are on the call podcast. Is this a podcast? Is this a webinar? What do we call
It's
this?
a webcast.
A webcast.
Boom.
Okay, cool.
It is a webcast. So
I,
we do have quite a few people online. I'm hoping at least one of them is listening. Nobody's asking questions. I
you
don't know
have
what's
a
going on.
voice. You should talk about this.
Yes, you do have a
Um,
voice, and you should talk about this because I think it's important. Here, Sean said, ethics is always personal. We each need to take responsibility for the products we make. I think a key for online products is to include the idea of adversarial user experience. Here, I'm thinking about the unintended use, sorry, of Facebook and the distortion of elections. Oh, yes.
right, and I like his second point of doesn't mean companies don't have obligations as well, right? They've got obligations to their shareholders, et cetera, to try to move things forward. There's a great a startup I worked with last year called Kobu. They're based here in Boston, and they try to make like if you think about a mix of Meetup, LinkedIn, and Facebook for people who live in apartment buildings. The problem they're trying to solve is a lot of people who live in apartment buildings in cities are lonely and they don't know their neighbors, and that apartment building doesn't really feel like a home. It's just a place to live. So they're trying to create a sense of community within these apartment buildings. And I think it goes back to we started thinking about, okay, what are the ways somebody could use this product and this app in a dark way, because they might know something about the person who lives next door to them, and how do we facilitate neighborly interactions that aren't
Creepy.
yeah. Exactly.
I'm sorry, like my bias was how do we make this non-creepy? But that's, kind of linking it back to what Sean said, ethics is always personal. What popped into my mind as a single woman who lives alone is how do we make this not creepy?
Yeah, yeah. And I'm looking at this like, okay, how do we make this so that people feel safe when they're using it, or they don't
Exactly.
think it's lame, or they don't like, oh, well, I'm going to stalk this, woman in my apartment because I can, and I have all this additional information about it that I can glean through this app. Yeah, so it's like, we went through that conversation, and then they still have a lot of work to do in that area, but trying to design in the right safeguards into the app so that
Absolutely.
those unintended consequences don't happen. And I'm sure there are other ways. Like we design a product, people use it in very, very different ways than it was initially intended. I can't tell you how many times I've used bike tools to do something that's not fix a bike at all.
And Megan just brought up a good point, which is she highly doubts that Facebook knew that the product would lead into the issues that it's facing now. And that might be entirely true. There are some, I'm not going to spin into talking about Mark, but there is some questionable behavior behind behind certain things that kind of makes you go, well, how much didn't they know, or how much did they know?
Yeah, you start
But
to see.
Megan does agree that we definitely need a code of ethics, at least to some degree, right? At which point do you stop yourself, or do you go like Megan has stated, if it's speeding off the rails? At which point do you go, whoa, okay, let's reel this back.
Right, and then there's the whole the speeding off the rails. That comment makes me think about the classic railway philosophy conversation of, okay, let's say you're a train conductor and you're driving down the train tracks, and you ahead of you, you see 5 people who just can't get out of the way in time for you to stop the car. There's a switch you could pull to divert your train, and there's one person to the other,
Right.
the other rail. So you have a choice of, basically hitting 5 people or hitting one person. What do you do? And these are ethical questions and conversations we should have. It's like rock in a hard place. There's no real right answer there. But you have to think creatively about, okay, what are the consequences of either case, and how do I think about designing a solution that might even prevent this in the first place? It comes to this, like, when does it go off the rails?
Yeah.
How do
what do you do when that happens?
Yep. So I think that's, as we talked about with the unintended consequences, I don't know anyone who thinks they're the bad guy, so to speak. Like, there was an interview with an FBI agent I saw maybe about 3 or 4 years ago. And she was talking about how that she's like, I have been in FBI working as a spy for many, many years. She's like, here's the one thing I can say is true. Nobody thinks they're the bad guy. Everyone thinks they're justified in what they're doing. So they don't think they're making bad choices. Now, those choices may be subjective, but they have specific reasons for acting the way they do. And, as humans, we need to have that level of empathy. And I think with designers, UX people, product people, we're trying to make sure we're empathic to our users as much as we can. When do we become too far removed that we feel so justified in the way we're going that we're not realizing that there's somebody else that's being harmed?
And that is why I love Jana's question of what problem are you trying to solve? Take a step back, take a step back and look at the full picture.
And I like to take that to the next level is, all right, well, what problem are you trying to solve? And then if you solve that problem, what's the outcome that you'd like to see?
Yeah.
Or what are the possible outcomes that might happen if you solve that problem? Maybe there are a variety of outcomes that happen. Which the one do you want to see? And what are the ones that maybe you don't want to see? How do you design and build around that?
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Guys, do you have any other questions? Yes, something just came in from Will, who is part of our team. I'm so excited that our own team is here. How can we make sure our justifications are objective and not subjective? That is a really, really good question.
Yeah, that's a great question that I wish I had an answer to, because objectivity and subjectivity are so...
You know what comes to mind is actually going back to what I said earlier, Teresa Torres's opportunity tree. So what it does is it lays out various solutions to one objective. And it's not about finding the best solution, but discussing amongst the team to find out what is the best solution of all of those presented. So what tends to happen when you're working on a single idea is you bring it on your own bias, as Will said, and it becomes really hard for you to be able to call yourself out on that bias. But if you lay out all possible solutions and you bring in 5 different people, all from different teams and different backgrounds, they'll be able to give you a little bit more of an objective within their own bias, right? They'll be able to come up with a solution that maybe works for everyone as opposed to just works for you.
Yeah, and I think, is that Greg that I see? Could you test objectivity and subjectivity diversity? I think that's definitely one way to help. I remember a case where I was working for Constant Contact, and for the engineering team, they had a hiring policy for anyone to get promoted to a certain level or be hired into a certain high level on the engineering side. They had to be an open source contributor. And it turned out that that's actually a very biased requirement for engineers, because it assumes that somebody has the bandwidth to contribute to an open source project. And people of color and minorities may work second and third jobs sometimes, and therefore don't have the extra bandwidth to work on side projects at night and weekends, because they're either dealing with their family, they're working a second job because they're lower income, whatever it is. There was a bias in that requirement. So diversity in that case of like, well, wait, let's understand getting across different races, genders, sexual orientations, etc. Can that help us understand that better? And I think that's a great point.
Yeah. Megan just said as well, how often do you take a step back and try to refocus the problem that you're trying to solve? So I don't know about you, but what we do here at ProdPad is we have something called the product tree, and we kind of play the game, so to speak, at least twice a year, and it gives us the opportunity to look at the roadmap and kind of reshuffle everything, but as a team. And it often happens that whatever was a priority, and this is pretty common, whatever's a priority at the beginning of the year isn't a priority towards the end of the year, right? But it gives you that, that opportunity to look at everything again and say, okay, are we still trying to solve the same problems, and why?
Yeah, we do a similar thing of we not only try to say what problem are we solving, but we do try to say what's the outcome we're looking for. We'd want to see more users engaging in this behavior, or more use of this area of the product, or less of X or Y or Z. We try to define the outcomes that we're driving towards. And I think we look back at them probably, maybe not weekly, but I would definitely say a monthly to quarterly kind of basis, saying, are we moving the needle? Are we seeing those outcomes that we want to? There's definitely a bit of you can't move what you can't measure. There's lots of subjectivity to that, but we constantly try to look back and saying, are we getting the outcomes that we wanted, that are beneficial for us? Because you've got your users you're trying to create value for, and your value for your company as well, and you really your product has to sit in the middle and do both, and making sure that you're looking at outcomes that on both sides of that, and hopefully they are driving towards ethical outcomes, not unethical outcomes. Or if you observe this unintended consequence, how do you then incorporate that? And then maybe that's the case, is we don't know how to incorporate those unintended consequences. Like, well, we didn't intend our product to do that, but maybe we need to think differently about that.
Yeah, I might wrap up with this question, which I think is absolutely fantastic. Russell just asked, have you ever found yourself in a position where you have to question those product ethics yourself? And kind of go,
Yeah, I will. So this happened to me relatively recently. So I recently joined a company that's an IoT industrial product, and I'm leading the product team there. And we went out to visit one of our clients, and a lot of our clients are discrete manufacturers. So raw materials in, part comes out. And one of our clients is a gun manufacturer. And he literally said, yeah, here's one of the parts we make, and basically drops this, basically put piece of a gun in my hand. And I was like, oh, wow. And so I was like, wow, so wait, we're helping people make guns more efficiently. And is this, and I started this, that's the one that the sort of second, third order of wait a minute, what am I doing here? Is this the right thing to do?
yeah.
This is a hard thing to think through, because then it's like, well, there are other companies that we work with that make medical equipment and medical supplies. And so that's actually saving people. So is what we're doing a bad thing or a good thing? And this is where it's like, wow, how do we actually make these trade-offs?
Yeah, definitely. I have found myself, we have actually had this discussion within ProdPad, and very fairly somebody asked, what happens the day that the NRA decides to purchase a ProdPad account, or, Breitbart's, or whatever. How do we handle that? And there was a lot of back and forth, justifying it, but also against it. And it kind of comes down to, each company's code of ethics, and saying, okay, well, do we want to, in a second order type thing, do we want to be somewhat related to what these people are doing, even if it's something as simple as a product management software? I mean, we're still helping them, whether we like to or not. Do we still take the cash, the revenue, or do we not? So I think it's like I said, for something as simple as a product management software, where you don't think this might be used for evil, it could be. I don't actually know. I don't know the thousands of clients that we have. That's the reality. But if you do catch someone, do you call yourself out, or do you call out that company and go, do we really want to, to support that in any way? We haven't come across anyone yet, but the question is still going to be there always. What happens the day that? So it's, I hope we never have to be in that position.
Right. No, I agree.
Somebody's going to have to take a stance and go, okay, well, do we want to be involved? Do we not want to be involved?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's always a challenge into thinking about, wow, okay, there's right, but I think about the example of the having a gun part placed in my hand, and it was like, whoa, what we're doing is helping them, but you know that single woman who's being attacked by some guy could defend herself, right? So there's all sorts of different use cases, and that goes a little bit back to the question of, well, where's the responsibility lie?
Exactly.
And are we responsible for everyone else's behavior? And that, no, we're not.
Or are we enabling that behavior?
Right. And so where does that responsibility lie, and what should our code of ethics say? And I think that's probably something that would be really interesting, is what would a product code of ethics look like? And how do we think through that? Because we should be thinking through second and third order consequences. What would that product ethics code look like? I think that would be a really interesting exercise to.
And I think that is
maybe we should write one after this
maybe we could try
this webcast.
We could definitely try, and I think that is a wonderful question to leave in everyone's mind as we wrap this up. Maybe you guys want to take this to your own companies and think about what your own company's code of ethics looks like. At some point we're going to be faced with it, whether we like it or not, and it comes down to who bears the responsibility. Do we want to contribute to certain things? Do we make ourselves responsible? Do we put the onus on someone else? There's a lot of really, really good questions that I think will have me thinking for a while as well.
Yeah. More questions than answers is typically what happens with this, because ethics are murky, and they are subjective, and that's what's hard. Because they're based on values, and what you value and what I value could be similar, but yet,
yeah, absolutely.
And neither one's wrong.
There's a new podcast called Should This Exist, worth a listen. I will definitely.
Yep. Oh yes, I think Should This Exist is definitely. I think it's an offshoot of Reed's podcast around, not How I Built This, Masters of Scale. I think it's something like that, or a similar company. But that, and also read like something like Ruined by Design by Mike Monteiro. That's another good book, or Evil by Design. It's really interesting to think through that of like, oh yeah, there's interesting patterns out there that we should be mindful of as we are developing these products.
Yep, definitely. Anyway, thank you so much, C.Todd.
Thank you.
Thank you for this discussion. Everyone, I hope you take something away from this. Think about it. If you want to tweet at C.Todd, is it at C.Todd?
I am
C.Todd. There we go. Yep. So I'm going to post this. I am C.Todd. That is his Twitter, so you can tweet at him. You can also tweet at me. I have no idea what mine is, but I think it's this one. Or at ProdPad. And we will definitely be sending out this recording shortly, probably actually Monday. So Monday's, soon enough. And if you want to share it with your team, share it with your company, maybe have a chat around product ethics yourselves. I think that would be wonderful. Let us know what happens. Thanks, everyone.